What if I told you the biggest threat to America's future was its past? The moment Emily Carter said those words, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Students sat up straighter, phones stopped buzzing, even the professor moderating. The debate glanced up from his notes. Emily let the silence stretch, a confident smirk curling at the edge of her lips. That was the trick. Control the silence, and you control the room. She tapped the microphone twice, the sharp sound cutting through the thick air. Then she leaned in. America is stuck in the past, stuck under the control of people who don't understand us, people who don't understand the world we live in, people who have made mistake after mistake yet still refuse to step aside. And I have one question for you all. Why are we still letting them decide our future? A ripple of murmurs spread across the crowd. Some nodded, others frowned, but Emily knew she had their attention. That was all she needed. She paced the stage, like a predator circling its prey. Let me paint a picture for you, she continued. Imagine you're in a car hurtling down the highway at 70 miles an hour. You're in the passenger seat, young, sharp, ready to take the wheel. But instead, the driver, an old man with blurry vision and shaky hands, refuses to let go. He keeps missing exits. He speeds up when he should slow down. He ignores the warning signs. And worst of all, he won't listen when you try to tell him he's about to crash. That's America. A few students clapped. Others whispered to their neighbors. Emily felt the momentum building. This country is still being driven by people who can barely use an iPhone. People who still think email is cutting-edge technology. People who remember a time when you had to rewind movies to watch them again. And yet, they have the power to shape laws that will affect us for decades to come. How is that fair? The energy in the room was shifting now, swelling in her favor. Emily went in for the kill. Think about it, she said, voice low but urgent. The average age of a U.S. senator is 65 years old. 65. The average age of a House representative? 57. The president? 80. She let that number linger. Now let me ask you something. When was the last time your grandpa really understood what it's like to be you? When was the last time he worried about student loan debt or AI, taking jobs, or what climate change will do to your future? A few nervous laughs, heads nodding. They don't understand us, yet they have all the power. And I say, enough. Thunderous applause exploded across the room. Some students whistled. Others raised their fists in agreement. Emily lifted her chin. Now we're talking. She pressed forward. I'm not just here to complain. I have a solution. A hush fell over the crowd. We need a change. We need new voices, new leaders, people who actually have a stake in the future they're shaping. That's why I propose a new law. No one over 50 should be allowed to hold public office. No one over 50 should vote. Gasps, a few cheers, a few shocked expressions, a few students exchanged glances, as if checking to make sure they'd heard her right. Good. That's exactly what she wanted. Emily let the reaction settle before driving it home. Think about it. If you won't be around in 30 years, why should you get to make decisions that affect the next 30 years? If you don't understand the world as it is today, why should you be allowed to shape the world of tomorrow? More nods. More whispers. The momentum was undeniable. Emily smiled. She had won the crowd, or so she thought, because in the third row, a young man sat perfectly still, unmoved, unimpressed. He was hard to miss. Tall, sharp-featured, dressed in a crisp navy suit that stood out in a sea of hoodies and sneakers. His golden hair was combed back with precision, and his blue eyes locked onto Emily with the kind of intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Few recognized him, but his name was about to change the night. Barron Trump. The professor, Dr. Harrison, finally spoke, his voice cutting through the buzz of the room. Does anyone have a counterpoint? Silence. Then, from the third row, a voice. Steady, unshaken. I do. Heads turned. Emily's smirk widened until she saw who had spoken. Barron Trump rose from his seat, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And in that moment, the energy in the room shifted. The debate had only just begun. Emily's smirk didn't fade, but something in her eyes flickered when she realized who had spoken. Barron Trump. The name alone carried weight. He wasn't just another student looking to argue for extra credit. He was the son of a former president, heir to a real estate empire, a young man raised in the corridors of power. And yet, for someone born into privilege, he carried himself with a quiet intensity that made him seem different. He buttoned his suit jacket with practiced precision as he stepped toward the podium. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, like a chess master setting up his next move. Emily, always one to seize control of the room, decided to strike first. "Well, well," she drawled into the microphone, crossing her arms. "Look who finally decided to join us. Daddy's boy himself." A few scattered chuckles. Someone in the back coughed, trying to hide a laugh. But Barron didn't even blink. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked Emily directly in the eye. "Thank you for your passionate speech," he said smoothly, his voice steady, carrying an unexpected warmth. "I can tell you really believe in what you're saying." Emily frowned slightly. That wasn't the response she expected. No immediate attack. No snarky comeback. Then Barron did something that caught everyone off guard. He smiled. Not a smirk. Not a grin of condescension. A real, genuine smile. "But passion without wisdom," he continued, "is like a ship without a rudder. Powerful, but dangerous." The room went still. Emily blinked, caught off guard for the first time that night. Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but unshakable. "You talk about progress, about moving forward. But you think the only way to do that is by tearing down the people who came before us. That's not progress, Emily. That's arson." A murmur spread through the crowd. Even some of Emily's most vocal supporters exchanged glances. Emily, however, recovered quickly. She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, come on," she scoffed. "You're really going to stand there, dressed like a Wall Street banker, and defend the same people who got us into this mess?" Barron didn't take the bait. Instead, he took a slow step forward, scanning the crowd. "You say people over 50 shouldn't have a voice in our future," he said. "But do you realize who you're talking about?" Emily opened her mouth to interrupt, but Barron raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to command the space. "Let's take a look," he continued. "Elon Musk, 52. The man literally trying to take humanity to Mars. Should we silence him?" Emily rolled her eyes, but Barron didn't stop. "Bill Gates, 68. Still funding medical research that has saved millions of lives. Should we ignore his contributions?" The room was growing quiet again. "How about Dr. Fauci? 83. You don't have to agree with him, but he helped lead the fight against a global pandemic. Should we pretend his experience doesn't matter?" Emily's supporters were shifting in their seats now, unsure whether to cheer or stay silent. Barron wasn't done. "Or let's take something closer to home. The professors who teach us, the scientists who create life-saving medicines, the engineers designing the next generation of clean energy, the veterans who fought for our freedoms." His blue eyes locked onto Emily's. "Are they dinosaurs, Emily?" A hush fell over the room. Emily clenched her jaw. She wasn't about to let some billionaire's kid outmaneuver her. She exhaled sharply. "You're cherry-picking," she shot back. "For every Elon Musk, there's 100 out-of-touch boomers clinging to power while the rest of us suffer." Barron Trump nodded thoughtfully, as if he was genuinely considering her words. "You're right," he admitted. "Not everyone over 50 is a visionary. Just like not every young person is enlightened. Some people make bad decisions at any age. But here's the difference." He took a step closer. "You want to erase an entire generation just because some of them made mistakes." Emily flinched, just slightly, but Barron saw it. "You talk about fairness," he continued, his voice like a knife wrapped in silk. "But tell me, what's fair about silencing millions of Americans just because they were born before you? What's fair about throwing away decades of knowledge and experience just because it doesn't fit your worldview?" Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. Barron pressed on. Progress isn't about age, he said. It's about wisdom. And wisdom isn't exclusive to the young or the old. It's earned. A silence stretched between them. Then in the back of the room, someone started clapping. One clap, then another, then another. The sound grew, spreading like wildfire. Emily's supporters hesitated, but then, slowly, reluctantly, even some of them joined in. For the first time that night, Emily Carter felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Barron stepped back from the podium, letting the weight of his words settle. "That's all I have to say," he finished, his voice calm. Then, without another word, he returned to his seat. Emily swallowed hard, gripping the podium. She had spent her entire college career dominating debates. But this was different. Because, for the first time, she wasn't sure if she had already lost. Emily Carter wasn't used to losing, and yet as Barron Trump returned to his seat, a strange, unfamiliar weight settled on her chest. The applause had stopped, but the energy in the room had shifted. She could feel it, like the air right before, a thunderstorm. She gripped the podium tighter, forcing herself to breathe. No way. I'm not losing to some rich kid playing philosopher. She glanced toward the moderator, Professor Langford, hoping for some kind of lifeline. But the old professor just leaned back in his chair, stroking his gray beard, eyes filled with something between amusement and curiosity. He wasn't going to step in. This was still her fight. Emily straightened, flipping her hair over one shoulder. Fine. If Barron wanted a battle, he was going to get one. "You know," she said, forcing a smirk, "it's funny that you bring up wisdom. Because if we're being honest, Barron, I don't think you have any idea what it's like to struggle." Barron raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. He didn't have. Emily could feel the crowd leaning in again. She had them back, for now. "Let's be real," she continued, stepping away from the podium, pacing like a lawyer in a courtroom. "You grew up in a golden tower. You've never had to worry about rent, or medical bills, or whether your degree would actually get you a job." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "You talk about respecting the past, but what about the future? Our generation is drowning in debt, the planet's on fire, and we're supposed to listen to the same people who got us into this mess?" She turned to the audience now, spreading her arms wide. "How many of you have had to work 2 jobs just to afford tuition?" A few hands shot up. "How many of you have parents who were laid off because some billionaire decided profits were more important than people?" More hands. "And how many of you?" She spun back to Barron, eyes flashing. "Believe that a kid born into a billion-dollar empire really understands what it means to fight for survival?" The audience erupted, cheers, whistles. A few people even stomped their feet. Emily felt the rush of adrenaline flood back into her veins. "That's right, this is my stage." Barron, to his credit, didn't flinch. He simply waited, letting the noise die down before he responded. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice steady. "I was born into wealth. I've never had to wonder where my next meal is coming from, and I won't pretend to understand what that feels like." Emily opened her mouth, ready to pounce, but Barron held up a finger. "But," he continued, "that also means I've had a front-row seat to power. I've seen how the world actually works, not the version they teach you in textbooks. The real brutal cutthroat version." He stood up again, buttoning his suit jacket. The room went silent. "You think the enemy is old people?" he asked, stepping closer to the center of the stage. "You think if we just push them out, everything magically fixes itself?" He let the question hang in the air before shaking his head. "That's not how it works, Emily." Emily narrowed her eyes. "Oh? Enlighten me." Barron smiled, not in mockery, but like someone who knew something no one else did. "Power isn't about age," he said. "It's about leverage." The crowd stirred. Emily crossed her arms. "And what exactly does that mean?" Barron's eyes scanned the room, locking onto random students in the audience as he spoke. "Think about the companies that control your student loans, the tech firms that own your data, the banks that decide whether you can afford a home." He turned back to Emily. "You think it's boomers running those?" No, it's people in their 30s and 40s. People who grew up with us but learned to play the game before we even knew there was one. A ripple of unease spread through the room. You talk about revolution, Barron continued, voice rising just slightly. But do you even know who you're fighting? Emily hesitated. Just for a second. Barron saw it. He pressed forward. If you want real change, you don't just replace one ruling class with another, he said. You have to understand why they have power in the first place. His voice dropped lower, forcing everyone to lean in. And more importantly, how to take it. Dead silence. Emily swallowed. For the first time, she realized she wasn't arguing with some spoiled rich kid. She was arguing with someone who had spent his entire life studying power itself. Barron let the silence stretch before stepping back, tilting his head slightly. Your move, Emily. The room waited, and for the first time since stepping onto that stage, Emily wasn't sure what to say. A bead of sweat traced its way down Emily's spine. She could feel it now, the shift. The way the crowd teetered on the edge, waiting for her to respond. Barron had taken her own argument and twisted it into something razor-sharp, slicing through her confidence with surgical precision. He wasn't just debating anymore. He was winning. Emily clenched her fists. Not yet. She stepped forward, forcing herself to smirk. That was cute, Barron. Really. You almost had me there. A chuckle rippled through the audience, nervous but real. Good. They weren't completely under his spell yet. Emily exhaled, steadying herself. You say power isn't about age. It's about leverage. Fine. I'll play along. But let me ask you this. Where does that leverage come from? Barron tilted his head, intrigued but silent. Emily turned, addressing the crowd instead. He wants you to believe that power is just this invisible force, floating around, waiting to be seized by whoever understands the game best. She spread her arms. But let's talk about who builds that game. She let the question linger, before answering it herself. It's not some grand conspiracy of 30-year-old tech bros and Wall Street elites plotting in secret. Power is built on systems, ones that have been rigged for generations. And you, Barron. She turned back to him, her eyes locked on his. You didn't study power. You inherited it. A sharp oof echoed from the crowd. A few heads nodded. Barron gave a small, knowing smile. I never denied that. Emily pressed forward. You want to sound noble, like you've transcended privilege by understanding it. But tell me this, what have you actually done with that knowledge? Barron's smile didn't fade, but something in his posture shifted. He didn't have an immediate answer. Emily's heart pounded. Gotcha. She turned back to the audience, seizing the moment. See, this is the real problem. The people at the top always think they deserve their place. They convince themselves that understanding the game is the same as earning their position. She jabbed a finger toward Barron. But tell me, Barron, if you woke up tomorrow with $0 in your bank account, no family name, no connections, would you still be sitting here, acting like the smartest guy in the room? A loud whoop shot from somewhere in the back. Then another. The energy was shifting again, swinging back in her favor. Barron let out a slow breath, adjusting his cufflinks. Hypotheticals are fun, but the reality is, that's not how the world works. Emily smirked. Exactly. And that's the problem. The crowd roared. For the first time, Barron looked unsettled. Not defeated, but no longer in full control. Emily seized the opportunity. You want to talk about real power? Here's a fun fact for you. Throughout history, the average revolution isn't started by the poorest people. It's started by the educated but disillusioned, the ones who almost made it but got shut out at the last second. She pointed to the audience. Them. A crackle of electricity spread through the room. Emily pressed on. The ones drowning in student debt, watching billionaires get tax breaks while they scrape together rent money. The ones who played by the rules and still got screwed. You think they're going to sit back and let leverage decide their future? She turned back to Barron, stepping right into his space. That's where real power is, not in boardrooms, Not an inheritance, but right here, on the edge of breaking. Barron held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he leaned in just slightly, voice low enough that only she could hear. You just might be dangerous, Emily Carter. Emily's pulse spiked. There was something in his tone. Not condescension, not dismissal, but curiosity. Before she could respond, the moderator stood. All right, Professor Langford said, his voice cutting through the tension. I think we've all just witnessed something extraordinary, but I believe we're due for a final word before we wrap up. Emily barely heard him. Her mind was spinning, because for the first time she wasn't sure if Barron Trump was her greatest opponent or something far more dangerous. For the first time all night, Emily wasn't sure what would happen next. The air in the debate hall was thick with tension, like a thunderstorm rolling in over a dry prairie, ready to break. Students who had been cheering her moments ago now exchanged glances, uncertain. Even Professor Langford hesitated before speaking again, sensing that whatever came next would be decisive. Barron Trump stood, unshaken, his hands resting calmly on the podium. He exhaled, his blue eyes scanning the crowd with something that looked almost like amusement. You're right, Emily, he said finally. Emily's breath caught. Wait. What? The entire room seemed to inhale at once. Even those who had firmly taken sides were now hanging on his words, waiting for his next move. You're right that leverage matters. You're right that power isn't just something you study, it's something you use, Barron continued. He paced slightly, his presence commanding. And I'll even admit, you're right about one more thing. He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. If I lost everything tomorrow, I'd have a hell of a hard time rebuilding from scratch. Emily stared. She had expected defiance, counterattacks, and maybe even mockery, but not this. But here's where we disagree, Barron went on. You talk about the system like it's a machine that's rigged against people, like it's some shadowy force designed to keep everyone down except a select few. He let the thought linger before shaking his head. But the system isn't one thing. It's millions of people, some corrupt, some honest, some powerful, some powerless. He gestured broadly. It's us. Emily folded her arms, regaining some of her confidence. That's a convenient way to dodge responsibility. If everyone is responsible, then no one really is. Barron chuckled. You don't strike me as the kind of person who thinks responsibility is something you dodge. You strike me as someone who takes it, grabs it, kicks the door down, and demands a seat at the table. Emily blinked. She wasn't sure if that was an insult or a compliment. And that's where you and I are different, Barron continued, his voice dropping slightly. You think the solution is tearing the system down. I think the solution is learning how to use it better than the people who built it. A murmur ran through the audience. Revolutions don't always lead to freedom. Emily, he said, his tone soft but firm. Sometimes they just lead to new tyrants. Emily opened her mouth to fire back, but Barron wasn't finished. You say you fight for the people left behind, the ones struggling to get by, drowning in debt, shut out of opportunity, he said. But let me ask you something. He stepped closer, voice steady and cutting. When was the last time you actually helped one of them? The room fell dead silent. Emily's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? Barron tilted his head. It's an honest question. You give speeches. You rally people. You argue for change. But when was the last time you sat down with a single mother working 2 jobs and helped her fill out the paperwork for a better loan? When was the last time you stood in a food pantry handing out groceries to people who didn't care about ideology, just whether their kids would eat that night? Emily felt the floor shift beneath her. I know how easy it is to get caught up in the fight, Barron continued. To believe that the bigger the battle, the more righteous the cause. But real change doesn't happen in debate halls. It happens in quiet moments, in small decisions, in actually doing the work instead of just talking about it. Emily's throat was dry. For the first time in her life, she had no response. Barron let the silence settle before leaning just slightly forward. You want to change the world, Emily? Good. I respect that. His expression softened, just a little. But change starts with you. A slow, heavy applause began, hesitant at first, then growing. It wasn't just Barron's supporters this time. It was people who had been cheering for Emily earlier. People who had walked in believing they had all the answers but now weren't so sure. Emily looked around, her heart pounding. The energy had shifted again, but not in her favor. Not in Barron's either. It was something else entirely. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. Then, before anyone could say another word, she did something no one expected. She stepped back from the podium, took a deep breath, and for the first time that night, she said, "I think I need to listen." The room went silent. Barron studied her for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. Emily turned to the audience, eyes scanning the faces of people who had come expecting a battle, but were now leaving, with something else entirely. "Thank you," she said softly. Then without another word she walked off the stage. And just like that, the debate was over. But something much bigger had just begun. In the end, this wasn't just a debate, it was a wake-up call. Real change doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from listening, learning, and doing the work. Power isn't just taken, it's understood and used wisely. So ask yourself, are you just talking about change or are you making it happen? What are your thoughts? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Stay tuned for more.